It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our second of 3 visiting critic lectures this semester, with Gary Bates having launched the series. Both Josh Ramis and Susannah tonight, as well as their collaborators, are already having an impact on our studio culture. It's also great to be here in person, but this event is also being live streamed, so a warm welcome to those of you who could not be able to look at us this evening. Over the years, with incremental transformations of our program, the 4th year has given us the opportunity to draw in voices from the outside, to explore themes that are not always embedded in our core curriculum, and to speak other languages. Whereas the 4th year has traditionally been reserved for discussions of urbanism, we've also opened up space to explore more focused areas of explorations, from emerging technologies to unprecedented building types, and from infrastructures to global resilience. Susannah brings to our pedagogy a unique profile with a background in both architecture and landscape, working within the urban realm, where a distinct encounter with questions of politics, the environment, and engineering comes to play. The founder of DLANDstudio, she divides her time between practice and teaching. Having taught at Harvard, IIT, and Washington, she's no stranger to Cooper Union, where she taught some years before I arrived. So it's good to have you back again in this class. Welcome back. The place of landscape has, in recent years, taken on a more important status than that of the past. No longer conceived as the leftover space, the in-between space for the remains, the consultant for the architect. Along with the efforts of many other critical thinkers, it's become the space of contestation, often upstaging urbanists in the reclamation of the terrain that we as humans have so ravaged for the last couple of centuries. What differentiates Susannah from the landscape urbanists is her own critical presence and investments between landscape and architecture. At once attendant to the craft of the built environment, but also preoccupied by the processes that are about time itself, that which requires remediation, management, and restoration. As well, Susannah's media comments in St. Louis and Argento Plaza in North Little Rock are a demonstration of elegance and refined composition at work. It is her work on the Gowanus Canal and Sponge Park that reveals the ways in which she's invested in the ecological performance of its terrain and the processes that both precede and outlast our interventions on it. So within these spaces, she's shown us how to make urban rooms, objects, as much as she's been able to bring together communities through the liminal spaces that lurk in between. At the Cooper Union, so at the Cooper Union, on our studio with Nadège Giraudet. So I'm very pleased to have them both here. I'm also very thankful to Linda Pollak, who's agreed to moderate and lead the discussion this evening. As a fellow traveler, Linda herself is also immersed in common preoccupations about the city, and she's written eloquently on related themes in her book, Inside Outside, Between Architecture and Landscape. And so with this, please join me in welcoming Susannah to the microphone. Susannah.
Sure. I think I need this. I'll need this later. I could use this here. We'll wait for the Zoom, some Zoom feedback. Wait, not that kind of feedback. No, I'm allowed to take this off, right? Yes. It's okay? Okay. Great. A lot easier. Speak not through mouse. So the title of my talk today is the Geophysical City. And so this won't be an encyclopedic description of a lot of all of my projects. I'm probably thankful for that. But more of a focused look at projects that have happened at kind of key periods in time that relate to this idea of the geophysical city. I want to thank you, Nadir, for calling me last spring and saying, "Hey, will you come teach?" Because I'm grateful to be here, and I'm loving our studio so far, and it's really an honor to be here with all of you. As I was preparing my lecture, the mail arrived, and they included this week's New Yorker. And I had this really great image of this formula for New York City. And what struck me was that there was really something missing. And that was the green space, the parks. And yeah, there's a park bench and there's some pigeons, but there's nothing green and there's nothing performative about the green space reflected in this. And so, of course, what would it include? I thought, well, I need the most iconic green space in New York, Central Park, right? And parks and open spaces really make cities more livable and humane, but there's also more to that story. So historically, cities were cited because of advantageous conditions for human habitation. So the availability of food and transportation and security helped many cities in coastal and riparian zones grow. But there are also kind of inherent conflicts in that, which I'll discuss later. Historically, these cities really didn't pay attention to geologic and hydrologic conditions except to kind of erase them. But these geologic and hydrologic conditions often became features in parks. In their plan for Prospect Park, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux took advantage of the topography using Battle Pass, an important strategic site of the Revolutionary War along the east side overlooking Gowanus Bay in their design. And this 1867 image shows the future site of Prospect Park's lake, refectory, and lookout. And you can see it was a lot of farm fields, but there's some water there. And so they took advantage of the fact that there was this existing hydrologic system. And that all seems really sensible. But what's not apparent are the streams and floodplains and geologic features that have been erased from development. And that's what I was referring to in the beginning of this argument, these streams and these kind of hidden systems have been sublimated to development. Urban designer Ayman Daigle, who's been a contributor to our studio, referred to these hidden geomorphological treasures as ghost streams in his 2014 TEDx Gowanus talk, which is very entertaining and worth a look. So another visitor to our studio was Eric Sanderson, who wrote this wonderful op-ed in the New York Times on September 28th. And you might know Eric as the author of Mannahatta. And he highlights this issue of these hidden streams very well in this op-ed. So Sanderson argues that we need to let historic streams and waterways reemerge, and that if we don't plan for them, they're going to come back anyway. And they will do it in their own catastrophic ways. They'll do it on their own terms, right? So keep this image from his project also. This is from his new project, Wallachia. It's the Wallachia Atlas in mind as we progress through this lecture. But also keep in mind the idea that the reason he wrote this op-ed was because he saw a pattern between the places where flooding was happening in the city and places where there used to be streams. So it's important to think about that. So in terms of my practice, I've been considering the relationship between geomorphology and urbanity, infrastructure, performance, and beauty since I started my practice in 2005. So it's been a while. But using grant funding, I pursued theoretical projects, which I then applied to real world cases in New York, and increasingly now across the country. So I start with a big idea, identifying a problem, and I imagine an overall vision for how to make change. And people in my studio will sort of say, oh, that's what she's doing, right? And then the research and development involves establishing performance metrics. Some of these are scientific, such as reducing particulate matter in the air, or cleaning surface water runoff, or reducing combined sewer overflows. And others are more humane, like making places for kids to learn to swim, or walk safely to school, or really just experience nature. So if you look at this diagram, which is kind of small, but the point is that there have been these periods of exploration where I do this kind of theoretical research, and then there are projects that kind of spin out of that are real, where I test my ideas. And I've managed to get cities to do some pilots. And these are some of those big ideas, and actually these are mostly the big ideas, although one of them is kind of a pilot. But really a range of projects that I think have inspired other designers to consider the relationship between infrastructure and the environment as a means for creating new public space. I don't think that was quite as common as it is now when I first started my practice. And they've also motivated public action that have helped change policy, and that's really important. So today I'm going to talk about a few of the projects that are shown above, and in particular, I'm going to focus on those that reveal and use natural systems to benefit urban life. So this is how I define the geophysical city. So a really important figure in the 20th century, and also in my world, is this woman named Rachel Carson. So it's important to remember the legacy of Rachel Carson in helping to mobilize and communicate what industry was doing to the environment. Her writings about the dangers of pesticide use really helped catalyze a lot of change and political change in particular. So her writings, the first Earth Day, and the musicians and political activists called for saving the planet, all pressured Richard Nixon to sign very important legislation. So the principles and rules of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, when applied to systems-based landscape design strategies, and I would expand that to say urban design strategies, now empower local communities to proactively design more resilient neighborhoods. So this legislation has actually motivated many of my projects, especially the Gowanus Canal Sponge Park, which I would say was my first project that I would characterize as geophysical urban design. So all this legislation happened when I was like that big, and I was a little kid, but it really impacted me. I remember just thinking about the environment so much when I was growing up. And actually my college essay that I wrote in 82 was actually about, they asked the prompt was, what's the biggest problem that you see facing society? And I said, loss of our natural lands. And now I think, gosh, that was so prescient. I didn't realize I was sort of like with it then. And it's taken me a long time to come around and realize, wow, now I can really do something about that, or hopefully do something about that. So my practice has been looking at these various systems for a while. Back in 2008, I started working on the Gowanus Canal Sponge Park. It started with a conversation with people from the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, and they said, hey, we want to do something in Gowanus. And they were kind of this hipster group at the time. They were an offshoot of the Gowanus Canal Community Development Corporation, which was more of the old school local types. or people who have been there a bit longer. And they said, hey, how can we advocate for rain barrels and for green roofs in the neighborhood? And we said, well, let's take a step back and do a sort of broader urban analysis. They knew that I was good at writing grants, and I said, hey, I'll write a grant that'll pay for our work, and we can just collaborate, because I just wanted to work there and thought it was interesting. And I was also just starting to practice. So it was like, I was just hungry to do anything. To establish my own voice. So we started with this kind of mapping of the area, looking at how this landscape had transformed over time. And you can see that it went from this swamp to an industrial canal and into this kind of quasi-post-industrial condition that we had in 2007. It was a lot more industrial then than it is now. Now it's getting built up in a different way. But we had a really serious issue of water quality because of the combined sewer system. So at the time, there's a flushing tunnel that flushes water from the East River through into the canal and kind of forces all of the pollutants out into the bay, which may sound really heinous, but if they don't get flushed out, then they sit right there. That's all poop on top of the water. This is like a thing that's kind of holding in the poop on the water. So that was pretty disgusting. And then you also had all this kind of contamination that's just coming down the street ends from just garbage, and also from the fact that there's a lot of old industrial pollution in the area. But the combined sewers were also a big issue. This is water that's going into the canal. The combined sewage system gets triggered when too much rainwater hits our storm sewer system, and the sanitary sewers and the storm sewers combine and release this toxic, which is brew. So we thought, okay.
On purpose, right?
On purpose, yes, it's very intentional.
So yes. It doesn't come back up through your toilet.
Exactly, so it doesn't come back, and also so that it doesn't overflow our sewage treatment plants. Right. So that's a really big issue. So we thought, well, what can we do in this neighborhood? And this is the kind of abbreviated version of this Sponge Park talk, but, and we thought, well, let's add more permeable ground. And what's more permeable than a wetland? And the area was a wetland before. So we thought, well, let's restore that natural condition to the site in a way that is also kind of urban. So we came up with the idea of the Sponge Park. And so we analyzed the area and looked at the sewer shed and also the topographic boundary. So we were looking at the inputs into the system, and we calculated the amount of permeable ground that we would need in order to absorb all the surface water runoff for a 1.2-inch storm, which sounds all wonky in engineering, but it's important because the 1.2-inch storm was the state standard for stormwater catchment at the time. And so we said, hey, if we could just add this amount of acreage of permeable ground, then we can manage all of your storms and not have any more combined sewer overflows. So, but the other little elephant in the room in Gowanus is that it was this industrial site, and shortly after we started working on the project, it was designated as an EPA Superfund site, and so that added a lot of extra kind of regulatory issues, and it also stopped a lot of the development that would have happened back in 2008, which was good in a lot of ways. But this drawing was done by Eamon Daigle, shows kind of the extent of the toxins and the relationship between those toxins and the historic waterway, the historic swampland. So we started by thinking about, we were working at a time when city planning was proposing a prior rezoning to what they just released. And they wanted to put a waterfront esplanade around the canal. And we said, well, it doesn't seem very practical because a lot of the historic industrial buildings actually abut the canal. And so we thought about it and we diagrammed it. And we also proposed that we needed to have a wide enough esplanade to enable passage through the areas where you could get to the canal. But we came up with this idea of this urban promenade where the path wouldn't necessarily always be along the water's edge. It would thread back into the neighborhood and really cover more of the landscape of the whole historic swamp area. And the thought was that this would become this urban stitch and that these green areas could start to connect the Gowanus with some of the surrounding open spaces and create a whole park network. So that was kind of the first phase of the project. There's a lot more work that we did as part of this, but this is just the overview of it. But it was this master plan that talked about the performance of this landscape. We showed the location of upland bioswales and of these street end bioswales, and also came up with the idea of how we might manage the water at the street ends. So I have given this talk to my class, so I'm going to keep this part a little bit brief, but this is a very important slide, particularly if you're working in New York City, particularly if you're working on the waterfront, because everything is regulated. Like every inch of soil is regulated. It's crazy. Even the water on the canal is controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers because it's a navigable waterway. The sediment underneath the water is now controlled by the EPA Superfund people. In the upland area, the first 5 feet of soil are controlled by a state agency, the Department of Environmental Conservation, because it's a brownfield. The surface, anything green, is controlled by the Parks Department. The water that flows over the ground is controlled by the Department of Environmental Protection, which is our city water agency, but they also handle our sewers. The road is technically owned by the Department of Transportation because it's a road. You have to have access for the fire department and access for the sanitation department. And then also city planning is kind of like lurking over here in the background with these design guidelines that they require, where you have to have seats, you have to have a certain number of seats that have backs, and you have to have trees with canopy, you have to have shade structures. So there are all these regulations. Even the shade over the water is controlled by the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is a state agency. It's an incredibly challenging place to work. I think there were something like 200 permits that we had to get to do this one little tiny project. Prototypical, important, but tiny project. So we started by, to make this first little pilot prototype, we started by calculating how much water was flowing down each of these streets. These are standard engineering calculations that you can do. They're pretty straightforward. You can figure out how much water is entering the system, again, based on the 1.2 inch storm, which was the state standard. And then we chose a site for this pilot. And I'll show you what we did. I have a little video here. There we go. Okay, so this is our existing condition. We took out those green spaces because they didn't allow any water to get into them. And we put in street swales that did allow water to enter. And then we also added these things I call bioretention cells. Basically, I built it all with precast concrete, and I did that so that I could control the process in a low bid government structure. There's an integrated sidewalk sedimentation basin, which takes out all the cigarette butts and all the fines so that they don't get into the system. And then there was a pedestrian path with a sand filter underneath. And then there was a drain that happily was an existing drain because that would have taken another couple of years to get the drain installed just because of the regulatory structures. So when it rains, the water comes down the street and it enters the sedimentation basin. What that does is it distributes the water evenly into the cells, which is important because you don't want all that water just rushing down and washing out your plants. And then if it rains a lot and you get more than we had calculated for, then it'll go into the sand filter. And then go into the canal. So it does get some kind of filtration. So the idea is that over time, it'll grow and the happy plants and the plants actually that we used have qualities where they can start to phytoremediate the soils, they can clean up the soils, and start to foster healthy microorganisms as well, in addition to attracting people for access down to the water. So this is just a plan showing how these pilots fit within the 40-foot shore public walkway and a 10-foot supplemental public walkway. So that's kind of a standard for waterfront access in New York. And then this was the pilot when we built it back in 2016. I joke that it took 8 years to plan and get all the approvals, and took about 8 weeks to build because of the way that we designed the construction process. So following that, I got this grant from the Brunner Fund, which is an AIA grant, and it was to develop. It was to develop dynamic models for looking at tides, rain, and water tables. So all of these things are constantly moving in the landscape. And I thought, well, we all do this parametric stuff. We should be able to just, figure out how to use that technology for mapping the landscape. It's a little more technical than I thought, but I managed to find some good collaborators, and we developed these programs where we could map the dynamism of these systems and then test the effectiveness of different installations in certain areas. And a lot of the effectiveness actually had to do with the water table and the location of the water table. So this is a case where understanding the geophysics of the site made a difference, or it made us ask the right questions. And I think that's one of the things I want to communicate to you, is just asking the questions is really important. So really exploring these different ideas. So with that, with those initial studies, we were able to sort of gauge the effectiveness of our proposals better. And then we also examined how things like soil permeability we could manipulate the location of the catchment basins. So with this data, we could think about the scalability of the program. We calculated that each one of our little pilot street ends could absorb about 2 million gallons of water per year. So when you start to look at that citywide, you could potentially capture about 800 million gallons across the city. So some of the work that we did on the sponge part ended up translating to this other project that we did, which was part of an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 2010. It was a collaboration between my firm, DLANDstudio, and Architecture Research Office. And our task, or our prompt was to figure out how to prepare the city for sea level rise. And we were team zero, in part because MoMA wasn't originally going to, when they started the project, they weren't going to do Manhattan. They were just going to do these surrounding areas. And they changed their mind pretty fast. And so they invited us to do that, do Lower Manhattan. So this was the exhibition. I think it was pretty important. I think it sparked a lot of sort of critical conversations, in part because they set it up as a lab where they invited a lot of people from different agencies to come in and talk to us along the way. And I think it also inspired the public. It was up for longer than anticipated, and I think really had a big impact. So again, I went back in history, since you'll see this is a common theme in my work, went back and looked at the historic shoreline. So thinking back to that Eric Sanderson image that I told you to remember, he showed you in that the Wallachia an image that looked more like that 1650 shoreline than the 1960 shoreline. And you can see how we've kind of moved out into the water in order to facilitate trade. When the large ships were coming into the harbor, it really wasn't that convenient to offload your goods into the smaller boats and then bring them over to the shore. So we hardened the shorelines, we built out, we created land. It's kind of the New York way, this real estate alchemy. And by 1960, we had built out even further, to accommodate larger boats in these slips. And when you think about it, think about the surface area that you get for every boat with that plan, the 1960 plan versus the 1850 plan. It's a moneymaker as long as most of your goods are coming in by ship. But then highways were built, right? And then trains, or just the whole dynamic of the way the waterfront was used changed. And so by 2010, the highest and best use for the waterfront was for recreation and residential use. So we've seen massive development all along the water of these big housing towers and these new kind of waterfront parks, which on some levels are great, and some levels are kind of can feel somewhat exclusive. I just want to show this larger image of this sanitary and topographic map of the city and the island of New York, which was prepared for the Council of Hygiene and Public Health of the Citizens Association under the direction of Egbert L. Ville, who was a topographical engineer. And I want you to look kind of carefully at it, because all this yellow stuff and all the darker green stuff, those are wetlands and mudflats and waterways that surrounded the city. And the lighter green part looks kind of like that 1650 waterline. So here it is again in detail for Lower Manhattan. And you can see this darker green area. This is like Canal Street, and this is this thing called the Collect Pond. But look carefully at this profile. Again, that 1650 waterline, because you're going to see it again. Because we did an analysis of where the sea level would go with 6 feet of sea level rise, and then also where the areas of Lower Manhattan would be flooded with 18-foot category 2 storm surge. So we used the kind of the prevalent science of the time. It assumed rapid ice cap melt, and this was projecting out to 2100. And we called it the value at risk, which is important. There were existing seawalls, which we mapped. We looked at that in relation to the 6-foot sea level rise by 2100 and this category 2 storm inundation. So we present the material and then represent it. So we looked at the location of existing combined sewer overflows and then come up with a system of how to get the water in and how to get the water out. And we called this the new urban ground. So we developed a system which I think didn't get as much attention as that really showy image of Lower Manhattan with all the pretty green on the edge. And this was a lot more expensive to create these permeable streets. So this is the level 1 streets for absorption. They were permeable streets. We put all the utilities into waterproof vaults for the infrastructure. Then we had these level 2 streets for distribution and collection. You can see that the surface of the ground in the streets is all permeable paving. The idea was that 27% of the city is paved with roads. So why not make that permeable and kind of solve your combined sewer overflow problem? So basically this part of the system was designed to manage the upland rainfalls, so heavy rains like we had with Ida, the ones that Eric Sanderson was writing about. And then these level 3 streets for protection. So these were larger streets that could handle a lot of water. And these are really associated with storm surges. Like, how do you manage a huge volume of water that's coming in and get it out of the space? So you can see that we're only operating the area that is the new urban ground. Along with that, the street system, we had this new 6-foot higher hardened edge, which again, people didn't really pay that much attention to at the time. The 6-foot are these new waterfront parks with freshwater wetlands and salt marshes. And then the idea was that it would create this whole new resilient system. And then we created these sections to show how that would work along the water's edge, all around the city, over in Battery Park City. This water that could come into the city with these boardwalks over these wetland spaces, new towers. Of course, most of Battery Park City would be gone, but we just rebuild it in a different way, better way. And then we had this battery breakwater down at the end, which was designed as a series of kind of living landscapes out in the water that would initially be constructed using these geotextile tubes recovered with marsh plantings, and they would kind of change in shape and form over time based on currents. But they'd be the kind of places that you could go out in a canoe and zip around. And then over on the east side, we created this thing we called the East River Esker and Breakwater. So it would harness the power of the tides and the patterns of sedimentation to create a new ecosystem, and also allow public access to that waterway. And then we had this thing we called the sponge slip, reminiscent of the Sponge Park, which would be a new park space in one of those old slip spaces that used to be used as a place of exchange, like commercial exchange. Now it would be a place of ecological exchange. And the idea was that this would make this whole resilient city. So this was 2010. I'm not going to show you lots of images of what happened after. The lights went out. We had a huge flood. The power went off. Sandy created a tremendous amount of damage for the area, and should have been a wake-up call to make change, but not enough has happened. But in 2016, I was invited to create a plan for coastal urbanism. And I collaborated in this case. I like to collaborate. I collaborated in this case with Rafi Siegel, who was my co-teacher at Cooper back when we did a studio in the suburb. And our plan, we were commissioned by the Regional Plan Association to look at the waterfront of basically Long Island and sort of the metro area, but Long Island and New Jersey and Jamaica Bay. So we looked at different scales of operation. So this is kind of what regional plans, what you probably think of when you think of the regional plan. You think of this big image of looking at Manhattan and then everything that relates to Manhattan. You think of these beautiful visions of what that plan might look like. But the regional plan had gotten kind of like wonky, and it had gotten into lots of text and not a lot of beautiful images. And that was part of why they hired 4 design teams to develop ideas related to their future plans. The plans were typically kind of center and spoke plans, and this new plan was something different. So our idea was, with the BITE plan, was this was not necessarily our idea, but it was the charge of the 4th regional plan was to think in terms of eco-regions. And I have to, I think Catherine Sievet's fingerprints are on a lot of this. She's a professor at City College and an incredibly amazing sort of thinker in the landscape. But the idea was to design corridors and give greater recognition to ecologies and watersheds. So we started by kind of pulling back and thinking about ecological exchange in our area, and what that used to look like, and that did this analysis of where the historic streams and existing tidal wetlands and historic wetlands were, and then thought about how that has changed. So you see some of these images, sort of translated from the MoMA project, but how the nature of economic exchange changed the water's edge, but then how the developing infrastructure led to further changes. So the exchange that used to happen at the water's edge now happens inland, in part because of vehicular mobility, but in part just because we're not taking things off of boats anymore. So we thought, well, okay, here's the opportunity. We right now have this line between land and water, but we don't necessarily have to have this line between land and water. And when we have this line, there's a lot of pressure on that line. And by 2050, more than 2 million people and 1 million jobs will be at risk from flooding. So that includes power plants and oil refineries and wastewater treatment plants and rail lines and much more. So what do? We need a better plan. So we looked at the cost of this loss. With Sandy, we had 48 deaths associated with Sandy, and we also had about like $20 billion of damage. But then we also looked at the complications of how you actually make that change. So Brett Ryan, who's a professor at MIT, mapped all the little jurisdictions in New Jersey. So this is why, part of the reason why it's so hard to make change on quickly, because you have all these tiny communities, or just you have so many different communities, each of which has an elected official, each of which needs to have a set of decisions that are made that are good for the whole. But they don't always want to act for the whole. So it's an issue. And then you have organizations like FEMA that is trying to act for the whole, and you end up with situations like this, where you have this weird zoning that really doesn't make sense urbanistically. So a lot of my work in general focuses on infrastructure, and infrastructure systems work really well when they're connected, but not when they get disconnected. And so, working with Sarah Williamson, who's also at MIT, we did this GIS analysis, and we found that these were the infrastructure systems that got disconnected during Sandy, and that's a really big deal because you want people to be able to get to their homes, but you also want people to get out away from harm. And this suggests that that's not possible when you have a big storm. And that gets to the idea of mobility. And there's mobility of getting away from a storm, but there's also social mobility. And some people can move, and some people can't. So we mapped the socioeconomic status of people in Jamaica Bay. Actually, we looked at 3 different scales of sites, but most of what I'm going to talk about today is Jamaica Bay. But we looked at people that might be socioeconomically challenged or on a lower level, and then also people who might be physically challenged to move, say people who are older or infirmed. So we did this analysis of the kind of suburban condition, the urban condition, and the kind of affluent barrier island condition, and analyzed energy, recreation, conservation, and habitation as potential opportunities for what we do with this landscape. So we were trying to figure out something productive to do with this landscape other than having people live there. And so we came up with this idea of receive, protect, and adapt. So it was really all about migration of people away from its waterfront zones. To reshape the waterfront for the highest and best value didn't necessarily mean working on high-end residential anymore. It meant coming up with new hybrid kinds of landscapes. So we had these wet ecosystems, which were really on the edge. And we were imagining that there'd be a constructed aspect to that. So it's not just a pure natural system, but kind of a hybrid condition, potentially wetland mitigation banks even. And then you'd have this kind of in-between semi-wet condition. This could be like the sponge park, or some of the work that we've done for New York Rising, so landscapes that could be periodically flooded, or like our MoMA landscapes. And then you'd have these dry high ground spaces. So you'd build these at an elevation that would be the future waterfront. So, and then we realized that there was this unrealized urban potential of these rail corridors that ran on the top of the terminal moraine of the glacier. So basically there's this high point in Long Island, this hill that came from glaciation like 8,000 years ago. So that's where the train lines are. It's on high ground. It's away from the flood zones. And we thought, let's use that to create density further upland. So on the local level, that train line area, which is kind of underdeveloped, is out by Broadway Junction. Broadway Junction is right there. And right, where's that? Yeah, that's right. And so we were imagining creating this new city that took into account projected flooding in the future, and would create this kind of long linear city out around Jamaica Bay. Again, we zoomed in and looked at the property damaged by flooding, and then in particular the housing stock that was flooded. And so there was a housing need of about 263,000 units. And so we just moved it. And we moved it in a particular way. We wanted to develop on the high ground and then create places that would attract people away from the water's edge. So we wanted to move by whole blocks. So we had this idea of kind of sending and receiving blocks where we take a whole community and move it over time, and create this much denser city around this landscape. So we're adding population, we're increasing density, but we're really reducing risk. We're also assuming that the city was going to grow over time. And, with that extra landscape, with that landscape that was no longer for housing, we created this new linear park, or linear city around the park. So instead of a linear park around a city, we have the inverse, and created all these connections to it from other parks and from the transportation systems to create this Jamaica Bay and Bight City. So just some images of how we treat the edges. We want to try to make our edges different than they were done in the past, trying to make them so that they support more marine life, more bird life, more of a healthy ecology. And then we imagined this idea of kind of water life, that you could live in these spaces where you might even have your boat go up underneath your house. The RPA expects JFK to expand. You saw the map before. It's a little scary. I don't know how they expected us to do that, but they wouldn't let us touch that. So we said, okay, we'll embrace that. And we'll look at creating this new kind of ferry gateway to the city. So this was this idea of this water and gondola access for recreation and for access to the airport. So it's just this Bight City, this new anticipatory urban design strategy. So I have now sort of moving to sort of broader areas across the United States. I'll go through this one quickly, and I'll do this while I play my nice little song just to wake you up. This is where you can get up and dance around if you want to. It's the wrong song, damn it. I knew it would do that, right? Okay, here's my song. Okay. So we started working in, so we started working in Hawaii, and Joni Mitchell wrote the song called Big Yellow Taxi.
Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They took all the trees, put them in a tree museum. And they charged the people $1.50 just to see them. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. If I'm a farmer.
We'll stop now. Okay, so she wrote this song while she was in Honolulu, which is the site of this next project. And it was all about this just loss of this natural landscape. And so I always put that on when I'm thinking about this project. But we were asked to do a new ecological center up at the University of Hawaii Manoa, which is a little bit up the hill from the rest of the campus, and I'll go through this very quickly. But basically, it's a campus that's right next to a creek, and the Army Corps of Engineers, in their infinite wisdom, is talking about hardening the creek that goes around the campus, and that we just think that's going to cause disastrous problems. But it's interesting to look at Hawaii and the political boundaries. This is the opposite of Gowanus. There's like one jurisdiction, like one state, one city, just one. But it used to be divided in these really interesting ways based on these kingdoms. So these historic land divisions were based on different the watersheds related to the ownership of the land, or the leaders of these different kingdoms. So they related to the political boundaries. So it's a former agricultural landscape that unfortunately has been paved. So that pink, this is what Joni Mitchell was talking about. They've paved all of that landscape, probably mostly in the post-war period. And they've paved the watershed. So now the water goes down the hill and goes really fast, and it ends up flooding Waikiki Beach and causing a huge amount of damage. So we thought, well, shouldn't we make our project like a test case for how to manage that water, but also, design it intelligently so that it doesn't flood. So we sort of pulled apart the building, and we looked at the Army Corps, what they were doing, and we created this kind of buffer zone between our building and the Army Corps project so that there could be this more expansive landscape to manage potential flooding. And it would also be sort of a more lush landscape, and also use historic farming methods in its design so that it could become this educational feature for the campus. We wanted to connect to the culture, and this was a similar model down the hill. And we wanted to connect to the environment, both with views and then also with these demonstration projects and with use of local landscape, of local plantings. And so I'm going to just keep going on this one because I want to get to the last one. But you can see kind of this idea of this engaging landscape. There were a number of buildings which were pretty bad, actually, that were existing, and we ended up connecting them with a lanai, because in Hawaii you can have all your classes outside in these outdoor classrooms. It's pretty wonderful. It's always 82 degrees. Anyway, but I wanted to get to this last one, as well as I've gone consoles. So this tidal basin lab we did most recently, we did this in 2020, and it's we call it History Secured, and the task we were given was to protect the the cherry trees in the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. So our project is titled History Secured. It looks forward and back. It recognizes the power of nature and patterns that predated Western settlement of the area, and it draws upon the legacies, legacies of L'Enfant, Hudson River School, and the Beaux-Arts and the WPA. An approach that reconsiders the limitation of modernism, and our design embraces environmental and human complexity and utilizes old and new technology to create a more secure future. So movement with nature and ecology, the native populations migrated, and indigenous migration happened with ebbs and flows of natural systems. And ultimately, unfortunately, these communities were forced to migrate away from the area by Western settlers who sought to claim and stabilize the shoreline. So this is an image of L'Enfant's shoreline, and it's pretty interesting to look at what he presented in the initial drawings. In the initial drawings, this was L'Enfant's plan, and this is what an engraver created without L'Enfant's input. So you could see he created this fortified landscape. L'Enfant had this. His landscape looks like it's fortified for flood resilience, and this looks like it's fortified to manage an army. So in the 1800s, we had the power and the symbolism of nature as represented by the Hudson River School. And then in the 1900s, we had classicism and these monuments that were revered in part as a consequence of the World Columbia Expositions. So, and I think I'm concerned that a lot of small decisions kind of weakened the plan. And then in the 1900s, we had the Great Depression and the WPA, which brought a vision of landscape architects, and artists to the site. Post-war infrastructure and the tenets of modernism didn't embrace the complexity of ecological and sociological systems. Instead, a reactive methodology developed that addressed the optimization of engineered drainage, automotive mobility, and security. So I bring this into the equation because I think the paving of the surrounding area is actually what's causing the problem in Washington, D.C. And so I looked at the impact of that paving on the watershed, and discovered that 12% of the 15,000 square mile watershed of the Potomac has been paved. So if you look at the 1793 water line and the projected flood zone of 2019, you can see where the problem lies. This is just like that MoMA image. And so although this isn't necessarily an issue of doing the new urban ground, we're imagining a completely new urban ground. So, and it's really why we can't ignore the problem. So we looked at a strategy to connect different monuments, to absorb, and to secure. And we used a proven approach of using pilots and prototypes, and then developed a phased project. So this first one actually creates a jetty out into the landscape, which helps to trap sediments. Then we would imagine a waterfront developing in between, and a stronger connection to the White House, and between the White House and the Jefferson Memorial. And then this phase 3 of these new elevated edge. So we have this new public space. Sorry, it's just going too fast. This new public space and ecological infrastructure, and then sort of reconnecting the public with the Potomac waterfront, and creating a new gathering space at a new Martin Luther King Memorial. So we're putting Martin Luther King on axis with the Lincoln Memorial instead of in the place where he was, which is in the flood zone, looking angrily back at Thomas Jefferson. So we're putting it in this celebratory place looking west. So this is the Martin Luther King Jr. connection to the mall, to the on-axis. We created this new land bridge to the Jefferson Memorial, So strengthening the connection to the mall and to sort of fixing some of the geometries which were a little bit off, and creating this new cherry refuge. And then also creating a reflecting plaza and security wall over on the highway side of the Jefferson Memorial. So we have this section looking west with this lawn and cherry meadow, these new swimmable waters, and then this FDR Memorial relocation with this new reflecting basin and pier. Now, it's an infrastructure project. This is a detail showing how we're putting the highways underground. And it's a flood protection project because there's an elevated edge going all around the project to protect the assets like the African American Museum and the Smithsonian. So we create this reflecting basin with a weir that would overflow in heavy rains, and manage some of the water from the mall, this new elevated edge and constructed wetland, to create this balance of nature and culture. So that is it. So, and with that, I would love to take your questions. So thanks. I could have sped up on that last one, the last two, because I realized how late it got. I'm sorry.
So both have our mascot?
Oh, yeah. Mascot. Oh, we get to have them off?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Wow. So thank you. That was pretty amazing tour through the urban edges.
Through the years.
Yeah, also. And let's see, there's a way to sit here that isn't right on the and I'm just going to ask a little because I want to make sure to have space for students to ask. But I think thinking about your art and your practice, and of course, I got to be able to know you at GSD, where you were doing both architecture and landscape, which I think students also probably are curious about that. Like, and so it seems like, I guess I would just ask, like, your practice looks like you're very impressive and exciting and important practice. Looks like the practice of a landscape architect with a lot of understanding of engineering, of soils, of this, of sociological stuff. Like, in terms, like, I don't feel actively your architectural sensibility, which I know that you have, but I also know from your thesis about the Central Park Gates that, in a way, I think your passion is that you've directed your practice towards it's more like, it is the geophysical city, but it's like the geophysical urban design, where you can make the most transformation. And so I'm just curious how you feel talking to these architecture students. Is and has informed your thinking and your practice.
I think one of the things I appreciate about architecture is that there's a lot more control in terms of the overall framework, and it's a lot easier to understand architecture than it is to kind of, mostly in terms of communication, than it is with landscape. Landscape has this funny condition where in the 70s or even the 60s, it kind of drifted into this realm of big ecology projects and lost design. and I think that made it kind of disappear for a while. And then it kind of shifted over and went way formal, really technical term. It became very formal in the 80s with designers like Peter Walker, who did these really sort of landscapes that were so tight. I mean, even Dan Kiley, a lot of his work was very tight and formal and architectural. And I probably draw more on the legacy of Kiley than I do of Pete Walker, because I think Dan did understand natural systems. And actually, Peter understands natural systems. He just chooses not to use them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Which, you know, in some, it's a lot easier because it's a lot more predictable.
Tanner Fountain, and it's
Right?
amazing, you know,
Yeah.
the project of Pete Walker of Tanner Fountain, where he really does mobilize some kind of system of hydrological system. It's not a natural system, but it feels like one.
Yeah, but it's funny because I feel more comfortable in the realm of architects than I do landscape architects. I think in part because I do appreciate urban form and I appreciate urban transportation systems and sewage systems and all the systems that make us able to inhabit cities. So, and that also includes park systems. It also includes trail systems. You know, all those things those are landscape systems. But I think I'm most intrigued by the interaction of all the different systems together. So, and I have to say, when I first got out of school, you know, I tried to make landscapes like architects. Like I did these tiny tolerances and made everything really tight. Ooh, it was so, I thought, oh, this is just so good. And then like, I don't know, like things don't last as well when you make the tolerances get really tight. So you need to allow for a little bit more flexibility in terms of how things move in the landscape and how plants will grow over time or soils will settle. You know, you just have to kind of bank on more dynamism. So,
Well, I think, I mean, I always have loved the Sponge Park project, and certainly the idea of making this absorbent landscape cityscape that happens really at the place where there used to be a change from settlement to nature or natural systems, and that was turned into a line, and it doesn't work like that. I just want to say, what is a combined sewer overflow? It's a disaster, you know. And the planners and engineers who decided to do that to American cities really, I mean, the idea that you have potable water in your toilet, that water mixes with other water, you know, as it's going into water bodies. I mean, I've worked on sites also in Stapleton, Staten Island, that has CSOs, combined sewer overflows. And the idea that they're planned to have sewage overflow into water bodies is pretty wild, you know. And then, so cities are under like a lot of consent orders and stuff to clean that up.
well, and it's cooked into the code. So when I started my practice, you were required to take the roof from the water that fell on your roof and put it into the sewers. You couldn't use it in your garden. And now that has changed. Like you had to actually put it into a pipe. It was a code requirement. And now things are changing so that hopefully.
And so that in any case, okay, now I want to switch gears because I'm trying to get the architect angle into this, which is there, and I'm trying to bring it out. So when you talk in each of your projects, these huge projects that are bigger than what, even though, like you say, Gowanus is small. Yeah, it's small in relation to the city, but it's not, or to a region, to Jamaica Bay, but it's still not small in terms of what's transformational potential and so on.
Yeah, thank you.
But you talk about understanding the geophysics of a site and how you need to do that for each of these projects. And so if you have a site and you're designing a building to put on it, would you advocate for students to understand the geophysics of their site and why?
Yes, well, we've been doing this in our studio.
Right.
So yes, and actually we've had some guest lecturers that have taught them how to read the city. Like, in Gowanus, you can look at it and you can say, oh, wow, there are all these low buildings around the Gowanus. I wonder why. Oh, okay, it used to be a swamp. Or you look at Manhattan. The classic example that you probably learned your first year is that the buildings are tall down in Lower Manhattan and in Midtown, in part because historically, at least, you wanted to build on bedrock. You wanted to build on a really serious structure, like geologic structure. And so that was the landscape that could support tall buildings. But now if you look around the city and you look at the location of parks, this guy, Eamon Daigle, he said, look for crooked roads and parking lots and look for the abnormal conditions. When you start to see those kind of abnormal conditions, you know that it's probably an old Native American trail or an old stream or an old pond or an old drainage. So you can start to read the city. And I would say that is really critical for architectural practice. Never build in a floodplain. If there's one lesson I want you to take. All our buildings?
All of ours, because they're all in more poor neighborhood, the Jacob Reese Houses Community Center, almost all of many of our projects are in floodplains, and how you deal with it. They're city projects. I see you saying, oh, I don't want to say anything about Linda's project.
No, it's not your, you have an existing condition that you're
we have
working with.
existing conditions that then the work we need to do now with FEMA and so on is extremely, but they're built buildings, in places like what Susannah's showing where buildings don't really belong, kind of, where they're trying to regenerate them as performative landscapes.
Well, and in our studio, we're looking at the zoning that's been proposed by the Department of City Planning, and it's insane.
Right.
It's absolutely insane, and
the island is going to sink.
We're trying to think about how we can mobilize some political change to make that not happen.
We need to mobilize so much political change.
So anyway.
And what I think is interesting and what you really made legible in your talk is that if you think about understanding your site and understanding Susannah's words, the geophysics, so you figure, well, that's the geology, that's the hydrology, that's the different conditions, it's the topography, and but it's not just topography as a surface. So it's all these different conditions, and you think how you can work your way into them, and the trees and whatever plants grow there and so on. But what's really interesting is that you're looking that the present includes the past, and the past is in the present. And so it really means looking not just at Sanborn maps, which I totally advocate for architects to understand how things were built over time. And that shows really nothing of natural conditions, but to also look at I know I can never pronounce it, the map of the water, the Ville map.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Ville map?
Yeah. But to look at all the layers of all the maps and now it's amazing because 10 years ago even, 15 years ago even, those maps were not available except you would go into be in a library, get to look at something without your pencils with you and stuff like that. And now they're digitized and there's so much about the history of the city and history of individual sites. So being able to have access to that is the foundation of all of your projects in a way.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really interesting to look at is the fact that bathymetric maps, so the topography under the water, the bathymetric maps and topographic maps are usually drawn separately.
Just like the inside of a building and what's outside the building are always drawn separately in the working drawings, you know.
Right, it's not drawn as a continuum.
Like you don't see when you draw the ground floor of a building, you don't have the site plan with the planting on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you don't have that, because the disciplines are separate, you can have that. And it's important to know that you can have that. And that's the thing, is somebody who has these practices in architecture and landscape architecture knows that you can have that. Or maybe is partially educated in landscape, but then as an architect. But since I left landscape exactly because of what Susannah was talking about, I was 4 years earlier, no, a little more than that, maybe. What year did you graduate?
95.
Right, so I was 10 years earlier. But at the time I came into the landscape department, it was Pete Walker on one side with this like beautifully formed flat painting like landscapes, and that were purely formal. And then Carl Steinitz on the other, and it was a war. And Carl Steinitz was an inheritor of Ian McHarg, and everything, it was a completely, everyone worked together in a collaboration in the studio, and the entire semester stood around a giant table with many, many layers of trace on it. And it was this large scale systems analysis, which is important. But what you've done is bridge them, you know, and when I was in the department, it was a war, and I just left it after a year. But the fact that you could, that it was different enough, and that you had the fortitude, you know, to do both, you know, is pretty fascinating. I mean, there's very few people, even still, who've done it. You, Sarah Newberry, then, you know, but I think I've done one of the few integrated cross-discipline studios at the GSD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are only three of us who are double Fs.
Since then,
ASLA and AIA.
Right.
But no, I think people have done it, but it's funny because you get out of school and then people say, well, what do you want to do?
Right.
You know, do you want to be an architect or do you want to be a landscape architect? And so I called the State Board of Licensure and I said, what do? I need to do internships. And they said, get your architecture license first. So go intern with an architect that maybe does landscape scale work. And there were like 2 in the city at the time. Now there are tons. I mean, there really are so many now. But at the time, it was basically between Beyer Blinder Bell and Aaron Krantz and Extet. I don't think they exist in. Anyway, and Cooper Robertson. Yeah, I know. So I went to BBB because they were doing this really cool. They were redesigning the Erie Canal, so it's infrastructure.
How fun is that? Yeah.
But I get there and
the project falls.
No, the project was there, but Krista, like the woman who was doing it, was like, this is mine. Like she was very like, this is my project, and like, you know, go away. So I ended up doing theaters, which was cool. It was fun. Yeah. So I did theaters for a couple of years. I did the Century Theater. I did a bunch of theaters on 42nd Street. It was fun for a while. But yeah, and then I switched it up. Had some babies, like your age. So yeah. So.
And what is an esker?
An esker. We just learned that in class today. So an esker is a geologic formation that happens where there used to be streams in the glaciers. So it's a glacial stream. So all this sediment accumulates in that stream bed. And then when the glacier melts, all the sediment, the like rocks and gravel, they deposit. And they're like these snake-like formations in the New England landscape or in any glacial landscape.
Still, we're pretty loose. I mean, it's not consolidated into rock.
No, it's still loose material.
Right,
It's like a hill though. I
Right.
mean, it's topography.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but yeah, eskers. My dad was a geophysicist. I think you probably heard that. So when your dad's a geologist and you're driving down the road, it's like, there's an esker. I don't see it. I don't
Okay.
understand.
So what's a bite?
A bite? The bite is like a sailor's knot. It's the waterfront edge, and it's almost like an elbow.
Right. And so when you showed that map of New Jersey's bites, it's because New Jersey has a different structure than New York City. And it's many, many, many little towns. Is that right? Is that
Yeah,
what you
well,
were
no,
saying?
I was showing all the different jurisdictions in New Jersey.
Right.
So the bite is the big system, the big idea, and I was just showing that there are all these different.
They're all under different
groups that are all
jurisdictions.
under different
Yeah.
jurisdictions with different codes and rules and
Right.
taxpayers and who.
And then the overlay of all those other organizations like
Yeah.
DP and so on like that.
Yeah. So sorry, I kind of went past at the end, but
No, I just wanted to make sure that people could leave the room knowing what a bite was. So questions?
yes.
Sorry, so I'm just kind of really impressed by the amount of complexity that you're able to fit into your projects. Starting with the prototype project and then seeing that scale grow and also the complexity grow in terms of not only dealing with the existing condition, but also projecting onto a future condition. And my question relates to that projection. You're able to measure a lot of things because of the geophysical conditions that are here now, all the instruments that you have for measuring that. Some of the things that we can't measure for the future is what people are going to do. And some of these projects, the way they're presented, they're like clear lines of, we're going to move people here, or we're going to do this. And I think, like the forums in which you're discussing this, or the think tanks, the firms that you're collaborating with, the government arm, et cetera, how kind of are privy to that information now, and they're funded by kind of like people at the top, or the people who are privy to that information are at a higher strata than the people that are going to move. Most likely. My question is, what are the plans for informing the people that are going to move now so that they make educated decisions and they don't have to be forced to move?
Well, this was definitely the presentation to architects. And I wouldn't say what I said about, we're going to move people in the same way to a community group. We had a tremendous amount of community outreach and input from communities in Long Island and around Jamaica Bay and down in these coastal New Jersey communities before we made any recommendations. And we assessed what was most important to those communities based on the input that we got. And we talked to, elected officials, but we also talked to people in the communities. The tricky part, I think, is when you get into, public housing and a situation where people don't necessarily have agency in where they're going. I mean, it's also tough, like the Rockaways. Like I remember going, actually, I think it was a lecture here a long time ago. Maybe it was after Sandy, and saying, well, we just need to leave places like the Rockaways. And, people don't like to hear that. The single family residents that have those houses that were originally cottages that, were things that could, maybe get blown away by a hurricane and cheaply be restored, by a couple generations ago, have now been winterized and cemented in place and made permanent. And the people who are there really don't want to lose that benefit, right? I mean, it's value. It's probably the most valuable asset, or it's certainly among the most valuable assets. So people don't really want to hear that. But at the same time, you know, when we look at what's coming down the pike in terms of flood insurance, the people in the private homes are no longer going to be on the federal dole for getting paid out for, and I wouldn't say that way at a public meeting in the Rockaways, but there'll no longer be federal subsidies that are paying that flood insurance for the private landowner. And for the houses in New Jersey, they were mostly private landowners. And so what we said to that community was, hey, you know, you can elevate your house, you can, you know, you can do everything you need to protect your asset, and you can keep it. But we're not going to maintain that anymore. We're only going to maintain the access to, the government will only pay for a public resource. So our suggestion was that if the people who lived in those private houses wanted to maintain the roads and keep access to their houses, that they could do that. They could pay for that, but the government would only pay for access to a public beach, like a public landscape. So we drew the line down there, but that's because it was a community of very affluent people.
You're also talking economics in a way.
Yeah.
And I think climate change is bringing so many decisions that are going to have to be made that are going to be so tough. And they're all about this swath of the edge of the land, right? I mean, basically where things are built in lowlands and stuff like that.
And a lot of those landscapes were places that where public housing was built because it was land that was available and it was cheap. And it was available and it was cheap because there was probably degraded housing stock on it to begin with that was raised in order to make denser public housing.
And
so
it was fill.
It was fill. So I'm afraid I'm just kind of a realist in terms of what's going to happen in the future. And I don't, I'm not candy coating any of that in this room because I feel like I don't need to as much as I do in public meetings. But you do have to be really, really sensitive to the fact that a lot of people really love the memories that they have of being in a particular place. I mean, even if your apartment may not be so nice in a degraded public housing out in the Rockaways, walking out on that beach, memories of walking on the beach. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's hard to replace if you move to a new landscape. And people have a lot of really strong ties to the landscapes where they grow up. So, that's the part that I don't know. It's hard to replace that. It's hard to replicate that. But it also, you're also getting away from a really dangerous situation. So that's kind of a point that I try to communicate a lot. It's like, well, you could stay in harm's way, but you really are in a very dangerous place. So, you're going to have to be ready for that next hurricane, and you might get hurt.
So figuring out how to look at housing that's on an edge, that's vulnerable, and how that housing stock could be replaced inland or upland, that's something that is part of the systems that you look at.
Well, and with the regional plan, I think what we were trying to propose is that there could be another kind of housing that maybe simulates some of the qualities of being out on that waterfront, that you could still have waterfront housing, but you're protected by a barrier island. Right, so that the barrier islands that stretch all along Long Island they used to be these dynamic things. They used to change with tides and with sedimentation patterns, and there would be places where the ocean would break through, and that would create a new little ecosystem with its own special qualities. But we've hardened that, and the Army Corps of Engineers has hardened all of that, and that's created a kind of a challenging system, because the landscape is a lot more vulnerable. It still wants to, these storms still want to break through, but now there are houses on those landscapes. But those landscapes could become these new protective barriers. I mean, I think that's the idea behind that living landscape project. It's like creating a fake barrier island, right? So, we could create fake barrier islands, or we could take back the barrier islands that nature made. Or maybe we need both.
Right, because there's several issues. One is the hardening of the edge, and one of the main tenets of your work is reintroducing dynamic landscapes. But the other is overbuilding, and that's like something that the architect or the landscape architect rarely has. Like they tell us as architects, oh well, the building stock in the world is going to go up by 60% by 2050.
Well,
but actually, we have to use less, we have to emit less carbon, so architects have an opportunity. Architects have an opportunity to spend all their time keeping 60% more building stock from having an impact, by having so many codes, so many rules, so many regulations. And you look and you say, this system might be broken, but still, we are optimists. We have to understand the gravity of these situations, but still find ways to know that stuff can happen and we can make it happen.
Well, and if we're not involved, stuff's still going to happen.
Right.
And it's going to be bad. It's going to be worse, right? So we need to engage.
Right, but I really want there to not be 60% more building stock in the world by 2050.
Hey, thanks, Susannah. Okay, were you ready? Should I go? Okay. Thanks for your talk. I saw your talk. I guess it was could it be 10 years ago now here in 315?
Oh, maybe. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I'm certainly struck.
Yeah, it was 2012.
Yeah. So start by the trajectory of your practice from things that were really at the scale of an architectural scale intervention, like the little sludge park. A really sort of manageable, contained project versus some of your later projects, which are now at the super regional scale. And so will, in the best case scenario, become some kind of reality only over an extremely long period of time. And yet, in looking back at some changes in the city, I'm struck by, what were things that actually had a pretty big impact on the city as a whole, and yet somehow happened in a way that felt like they were pretty cheap. They were done by, with a really, an intervention type of strategy. And they happened really fast.
Yeah.
So like the change in the city streets, the parks that were established where the roadway crossed the grid, bike lanes, that kind of stuff. Like it felt like it happened overnight. Do you have some projects that you think can happen that way, that you're kind of ready to, in a stealth way, get into motion right now?
Yeah, I've got a whole lecture of projects like that.
Yeah.
Too. The stealth projects. So I think probably the most notable.
A pretty,
Yeah.
urban scale impact.
So a couple. One, I did a pop-up park at Brooklyn Bridge Park years ago that was like that. It was basically a design of a park that was up for a season. And it it basically took asphalt and painted it a lighter color. We put in these mounds of sod. We used a shipping container and made a little restaurant, that kind of thing. And that's something that I think can happen in order to mobilize community for a potential future park project. It also can help to manage the long waiting time that it takes to build big park projects like this. And then also more recently, I was the urban design fellow for the Design Trust for Public Space and designed strategies for the 666 miles of under elevated spaces in New York. Now, the book is on somebody's desk in our studio. I can't remember. Dove's desk? Or no, that's on William's desk. So if you want to look at the book, there's one. Yeah. If you want to look at the book, it outlines these strategies for what to do. So we had like charging stations over by the Queensboro Bridge. We had places where there could be portable art studios underneath the Brooklyn Queens Expressway or the Gowanus Expressway. We had places where there could be climbing walls that get attached to bridge abutments up in Harlem. We had, what were some other ones? Oh, down in Chinatown, we created a gateway from Chinatown through to the downtown. So we looked at all those spaces and we tried to come up with typologies, and they're all things that could be implemented quickly, in part because we did them in partnership with the Design Trust and the DOT. So we made sure that all of the things that we were proposing were things that the DOT was kind of on board with doing. And none of them are particularly expensive. So a lot of those things I think have been happening already. So that would be one, but it's kind of doesn't fall into the sort of the idea of the geophysical. And so I was focusing on this today. We've also done
Right, geophysical isn't a pop-up,
no,
basically.
no, it's long.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's longer, right? So we've done a lot of projects where we've retrofit parking lots, trying to raise the albedo. So albedo is the reflectivity index. So if you have a high albedo material, it's a lighter color and it reflects light. So it's cooler in the summer. So if you ever stepped on like bluestone in the summer, it's hot. But if you step on like limestone in the summer, you can actually stand on it in bare feet, right? So that's just a dumb example, but lighter color materials have a higher albedo. And so if you just take parking lots and paint them a lighter color, you're going to reduce the heat island effect. So that's important for architects also thinking about building roof materials. I think one of the things Bloomberg did was say, okay, roofs need to be a light color now. Like you can't do any more black asphalt roofs. And so the lightening of roofs helps to reduce heat island effect. So, that's a case where it's kind of a crossover with the building stuff. And I think, or with architectural work. And I think, probably the work that we did down in Arkansas that Nadir talked about, and maybe the media plaza that we did in St. Louis, those are more architectural in scale, and they just took a couple of years. They were like architectural timetable, and have been incredibly catalytic and important for those communities. So, yeah. Yes. You, yes.
So as people are displaced from large urban centers on the coast, how should we design or account for people moving into smaller inland communities that just don't have the infrastructure or resources to support them, or even like geographically, they're just not able to sustain large population?
We need to plan for it. We need to plan for that migration. I mean, if people want to...
Sounds like a big idea project for you.
Yeah, no, I wrote an article about this in New Cities. And I was thinking about Denver in particular, because I was living out there teaching at CU Boulder for a while. And Denver has all these parking lots, and it has just, it's awful. And it's just this driving city, and it could be so much more dense and so much more wonderful. And it already actually has a good park system. But the connectivity in the city is just really lacking. And the affordability of housing is now just, it's pretty bad. It's hard to find reasonably priced housing. So, I think we have to anticipate that people are going to be moving away from at least these flood zones, right? And that's just migration within the United States. Obviously we're going to have people from all over the world that are going to need a place to live that's on higher ground. And we haven't been the best actors in the United States in terms of accepting immigrants, but some other countries are better and are planning for it, and not only provide the physical housing stock, but also provide the social infrastructure to manage that migration, because it's a lot. But it's so beyond the Green New Deal. It's really it's something that I think is bigger than that. So it's kind of the Blue New Deal. Blue to green. Actually, I'm looking at that for an exhibition in Miami. I called Rafi to partner with me on it, because he's going to figure out the social housing structure, like a co-op structure for housing. But what I found or discovered or knew was that there's this place called Liberty City, which is a pretty notorious housing project. It's the setting for Grand Theft Auto. So it's it's actually a really amazing community. I worked there, I don't know, years ago when I was the Cejas Fellow at Florida International University. And what I remembered from that time was that it's on high ground, and a lot of the Black community in Miami was moved from Coral Gables to Liberty City, and a wall was built around this community. So, but the great thing now is that that's the high ground. It's the high value landscape. And so what we're trying to do is point out that this community needs to capture the value of that landscape and own it, and figure out a structure so that that can't be taken away, and so that they can, have some ability to amass personal wealth within that community and have a better future. I don't know, maybe that's overly idealistic to think that architects can do that, but we want to show possibilities. So anyway, so that's a migration issue. So yes.
Yeah, so your projects are so monumental and complex, amazing, but sitting here watching and listening, I was just feeling overwhelmed. And how do you make yourself, how do you compartmentalize all those different aspects? It's just boom, boom, boom,
Do you want to answer that? I was communicating with Dish last night. I was basically, doing 5 things at the same time. I don't like to compartmentalize, and I like to embrace the rabbit hole. And I like to have a lot of things going at the same time, because I find that the threads of different ways of thinking often lead to some really interesting, creative, new ideas. So,
but also you don't do it alone. That's right.
Yeah.
And
yeah, we were talking.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's what's great about practicing it. You talked about different kinds of collaborations, and I think that's important. But also working with urban spaces, urban design with a systemic approach, that you carry out at multiple scales, right? That you understand the site through its histories and its present, that you understand the site through its geophysical and its urban and all these different layers of sociological stuff and everything. But then that starts to, these sites that are often so fragmented, how you, like, I love the idea of an urban stitch, that project, that you get a concept, just like in the project that you do, that you have a concept, you have the big idea, and then you keep on returning to it as you go through. And I think that that shows in the projects, and I think that is the architect also, the education also.
Probably. And I think also in relation to your last question too, it's like, you have to take into account kind of the culture of different places. Like the idea of moving somebody from like New York to, I don't know, Cleveland or to Denver or to like,
radical.
Cleveland can be cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, so and New York can be uncool too. Sometimes I don't know. Just it's there are great things about different cities, but it's definitely an adjustment, kind of culturally, to I don't know, just like figure out your community in a new place. I mean, I felt that for 2 years in Denver. I don't know. What am I doing here? but now
Now you're back.
I'm back. Well, then I'm going back and forth.
Right.
So yeah, not too much. I don't want to kill too many trees.
But I think the big idea, that how Susannah introduced the talk was one of the most important things, and that diagram showing the relation of the big idea and then getting the funding and doing the systemic work. And I think that was really generous part of the lecture, to be able to lay out the processes and to see what it is to have a research practice. And so I think that and the duration of the thing and the different voices and collaborators, that it contributes to a robust concept that allows the project to unfold over time without being too fragmented, even though your site is fragmented.
Well, and the beauty of these research grants, particularly, if you look at Philanthropy News Digest, they have this they have this little thing where they send you little pings on grants that are available all over the country. So say you're from Cleveland, there are grants that are specifically focused on Cleveland. Like the Knight Foundation gives money to people who live in Knight cities. Now that's one of the bigger, fancier ones, so they're harder to get. But if you can find smaller grants a lot of the grants that I got early on were like $10,000 New York State Council on the Arts grants. And those are available. And you could apply for those. You are smart people. You could totally apply for those. And those are for New York architects in New York State. Wherever you're from, I'm sure you can find some grant funding. And I'm not being idealistic, because I did this in Denver. I went to the local AIA and they gave me money to travel to the tiny island nations of the South Pacific, which are going to disappear because of sea level rise, and look at the condition and analyze migration. So, they gave me $6,000. So I was like, okay, great. So I looked and I found it and I applied, and it sort of speaks to the importance of being a good writer also, and writing clearly. I'm happy to read anybody's grant proposals if you find one. I know. I offer that to my studio, but
That's a great.
But yeah. So I don't want to say that grants are the answer, but they enabled me to develop my own voice in the profession. I never worked for anybody that was really super fancy, so I didn't get kind of anointed with fanciness by like working for OMA or working for Herzog but right. Yeah. I mean, there's kind of the OMA, the REM. I call it REM juice. But I never did that. So I just worked and got experience and kind of made my own thing. So I mean, had great experience. I worked for great people, but yeah. Well, actually, I worked for Brad Clough, though. I guess he's fancy. So, but I only worked for him for about 2 months. And I was like, I can't deal with this. So, but yeah.
So thank you.
So thanks.